For over 2 decades, Manu Ginóbili has been present in basketball history as a near-perfect string of achievements, so cool and precise that people got used to taking it for granted. He won 4 NBA championships with the San Antonio Spurs, becoming an irreplaceable pillar of a dynasty built on discipline, intelligence, and relentless winning. He was 6th Man of the Year, twice honored on the All-NBA team, the player every coach trusted with the toughest moments of the game. Before conquering America, he had already won the EuroLeague in Europe, carrying with him the reputation of a basketball genius who refused to follow the mold. And on the international stage, Manu pulled off something close to impossible by leading Argentina's national team to the gold medal at the 2004 Olympics, defeating Team USA right in Athens and shattering the illusion of American basketball's invincibility. That wasn't just a win, it was a historic reversal. When his career ended, Manu Ginóbili stepped into the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame as a belated but undeniable recognition of a path full of glory, where titles, victories, and respect seemed so complete there was no room left for doubt. But that very completeness masked another, quieter and heavier truth, because behind the trophies and the applause, Manu had to live a life split in two. A public life where he was allowed to explode, create, take risks, and become opponents' nightmare, and a private life where he learned to suppress, shrink himself, step back, so the system could run smoother. He got used to sacrifice early on, not through heroic declarations, but through choices, repeated so often they became instinct, giving up the starting spot, accepting the bench, playing through aching bodies, staying silent when others got praised. Manu's pain wasn't loud or explosive. It stretched out like an unnamed pressure weighing on every season, every decision, every moment he stepped onto the court. His will wasn't about asserting himself, it was about the ability to keep moving forward while carrying questions that were never answered. Who could I have been if I'd lived fully as just one version of myself? For 30 years, he fulfilled his role with a calm so ruthless that when all the noise died down, when no one needed his sacrifice anymore, Manu Ginóbili stood in that silence and faced the biggest truth of his life. Achievements can be written into history, but the cost of living 2 parallel lives is something only he carries alone. If you want to keep following the story of the quiet life behind the glory that few have ever seen of Manu Ginóbili, please hit subscribe and leave a follow for the channel. Bahia isn't a place that produces stars prepped for the spotlight. It's a windy coastal city where basketball exists more as a labor habit than a glorious dream, where people play to build discipline, to learn how to stand together, not to get their names called. Manu Ginóbili grew up there, in an atmosphere that offered no favors to young egos. The Ginóbili family wasn't wealthy. No private gym, no scouting trips, no one sitting down to say a child in this house was born to be different. Manu's father was an amateur coach, a man who loved basketball in the simplest way, teaching kids to run to the right spots, pass at the right rhythm, understand that victory only comes when everyone knows how to give up a step. In that house, basketball wasn't talked about as a path to change your life. It was a way to learn responsibility. Manu was the youngest child, and being the last in a big family was itself a silent lesson. Wait your turn, share your portion, learn not to bother others. No one told him he was the center. No one built a sense of privilege around him. If he wanted to play, he had to wait. If he wanted to speak, he had to listen first. If he wanted to exist, he had to blend into the common rhythm. Those things weren't taught with words. They came through the air, through habits, through the way everything ran every day. Bahia didn't applaud standing out. It only acknowledged endurance. Manu learned to shoot in old gyms, to defend in practices with no spectators, to lose without complaining, and win without celebrating too long. There, no one asked him what he dreamed of becoming. because dreams weren't what people put on the table every night. What was put on the table was responsibility, the need to do your part well so the family and the team weren't affected. Manu grew up in an environment where endurance was considered normal, where swallowing emotions wasn't tragedy, it was a life skill. He wasn't taught to believe he was special. He was taught that he only had value when he didn't disrupt the common balance. That shaped a quiet but heavy foundation. Manu learned to sacrifice before he even learned to dream. While other kids elsewhere were encouraged to express themselves, pushed forward to try, Manu learned to step back, observe, and wait for the right moment to contribute without overshadowing anyone. No big tragedy happened in that childhood. No loud losses. No shocks worth retelling as defining moments. But the absence of affirmations, that prolonged normalcy, became the root tragedy, because it taught Manu that his value lay in enduring and adapting, not in the right to be prioritized. From very early on, he understood that to stay, sometimes you had to stay silent. To be accepted, sometimes you had to make yourself smaller. And when a child grows up believing his existence doesn't need to be emphasized, he carries that belief through life, like a shadow that never leaves. Those afternoons in Bahia Blanca passed slowly, sea wind blowing through old courts, and Manu grew up in that quietness, unaware that the unglamorous environment was preparing him for a path both glorious and painful. Because when you're taught to endure before you're taught to dream, you can go very far. But you also become someone used to carrying pain alone, without demanding anyone see it. And from that unprivileged starting point, Manu Ginobili's life began sliding toward a fate where sacrifice became instinct, and silence became his most familiar language. Leaving Argentina for Manu Ginóbili wasn't a departure seen off with expectations or well-wishes. It was a quiet, almost inevitable exit, as if staying would mean everything would stay frozen forever in Bahia Blanca. When he was still very young, Manu left his hometown with a small suitcase, carrying basketball skills honed in silence, but no guarantees that the outside world was waiting for him. No English, no connections, no system designed to protect a young player from South America. Manu entered Europe as a true outsider. Strange arenas, practices where no one knew who he was, conversations where he didn't fully understand what others said. All of it created a deep, familiar loneliness that hurt. Manu wasn't surprised by that loneliness, because he'd grown up in an environment that taught no one was obligated to notice you. Here too, no one waited for him to shine. No one had a spot reserved. No one said just be patient and everything would be fine. He had to learn to survive on the value he created every day. Practices in Italy weren't glamorous. Early games had no crowds chanting his name, just cold, evaluating silence from coaches and teammates. Manu quickly understood that talent alone wasn't enough, because talent goes unrecognized if it doesn't prove its necessity to the group. He played as if every minute on the court was a negotiation for the right to stay. Not the right to stand out, but the right not to be discarded. No one said it out loud, but Manu felt that invisible pressure in every glance, every substitution decision, every time his name was mispronounced or not called at all. In this place, he was no longer the kid used to yielding. He became someone who had to learn to stand firm without bothering anyone. Long nights in a small room, Manu heard the wind outside the window and thought about Bahia Blanca, about his family, about the feeling of belonging somewhere. But those thoughts were quickly suppressed, because he knew nostalgia wouldn't keep him on the roster. Manu trained more, observed more, learned to read the game to make up for gaps in language and status. He couldn't afford mistakes, because for someone no one was waiting for, a mistake meant being forgotten fast. It was during this period that Manu learned a harsh but life-defining lesson. If you don't make yourself essential, you disappear. No one reminded him of it, but everything around him operated on that logic. Manu began to understand that his existence had to be tied to the team's benefit, that only by making the team better did he have a reason to stay. That wasn't a noble choice. It was the survival instinct of someone always on the edge. Loneliness thus stopped being a passing emotion and became the default state. Manu got used to eating alone, used to no one checking in after games, used to being mentioned only when necessary. But instead of breaking him, that loneliness forged a tough shell, where emotions were carefully stored so they wouldn't affect performance. He learned to smile just enough, talk just enough, and play more than anyone asked. No one noticed that in the process of making himself essential, Manu was also learning to shrink himself, learning to accept that his existence didn't need public recognition. While others dreamed of bigger lights, Manu only dreamed of staying, of continuing to play, of proving he wasn't expendable. And it was in that loneliness considered normal that a part of Manu Ginóbili was shaped. A man ready to do whatever it took not to disappear, even if that meant living a life very few truly saw. Europe opened up a different space for Manu Ginóbili, less harsh than those initial days of feeling completely adrift, but it still wasn't exactly a place he could call home. In Italy, within the EuroLeague environment, for the first time, Manu experienced something entirely new: pure professional respect. People saw him as a player who could read the game, who knew how to sacrifice, who could do the tough things without needing his name shouted out. Coaches valued Manu's basketball intelligence, teammates trusted his decisions on the court, and fans gradually got used to a style of play that was smart, daring, but never flashy. Here, Manu didn't have to explain where he came from, wasn't forced to become a symbol, wasn't asked who he would be in the future. He just had to play well, and for a while, that was enough. But that very sufficiency carried a strange feeling, because even with the respect, Manu still didn't truly belong. Language remained a barrier, culture remained a distance, and the relationships around him were more functional than attached. After every game, when the arena lights went out, Manu returned to his apartment in the familiar silence, carrying the sense that the success he'd just achieved wasn't enough to fill the void called home. He won games, got praised, but there was no place to safely set his emotions down. The EuroLeague gave Manu a stage just big enough to exist on, but it didn't give him an anchor to let his guard down. Success came steadily, reputation grew, but it all stayed at a professional level, like a contract fulfilled to the letter. Manu began to understand that he could go very far in Europe, could build a stable career, even a brilliant one, but he would still carry a sense of impermanence, like a welcomed guest who wasn't invited to stay long-term. The victories in Italy didn't come with the feeling of belonging to a community. They felt more like personal milestones marked on a map that was never really his. He was allowed to exist, allowed to succeed, but not allowed to put down roots. On the rare free evenings, Manu thought about Argentina, about Bahia, about the old courts where he didn't have to prove anything to be accepted. But he also understood that going back would mean abandoning the path that had opened in front of him. Europe thus became a liminal zone, where Manu was no longer the unknown kid, but also not yet the person the world would remember. He played with intense focus, without complaining, without demanding, because he knew his position was the result of effort, not favoritism. That made Manu stronger, but also more isolated. He learned to keep distance from his own emotions, because attaching too deeply to an uncertain place would only make separation hurt more. The EuroLeague gave Manu a temporary sense of safety, but not long-term peace of mind. He wasn't crushed by the American market, didn't face gigantic expectations, but he also didn't find the warmth of belonging. Success here was like a bright room, with no windows enough to live in, but not enough to breathe freely. Manu began to realize he was walking a path where every step forward was paid for by staying in a state of suspension. He no longer felt too much pain from it, because that suspension had become familiar since the day he left Argentina. But that very familiarity quietly shaped a dangerous belief that not belonging anywhere was normal. Europe didn't break Manu, in fact. It helped him mature, helped him understand his value within a collective, but it also taught him how to live without emotional anchors. When invitations and bigger opportunities started appearing, Manu stood at a crossroads he wasn't fully ready to face. Success had arrived, but it didn't bring the feeling of home. And deep down, he understood he was moving closer to a world even harsher, where survival required not just skill, but an ego big enough not to be swallowed whole. And even before stepping into the NBA, Manu already carried an invisible baggage: the ability to live in loneliness, the ability to exist without belonging, and a dangerous habit of accepting it as fate. The NBA didn't open its doors to Manu Ginóbili with a welcome. It only cracked open like a narrow gate. He had to force his way through with every ounce of will he had left. When he set foot in the world's biggest league, Manu was no longer young by NBA standards. He arrived late, carrying his European years as both an advantage and a reminder that he wasn't part of the generation molded to become icons. Here, stars were measured by physique, speed, confident language, and sound bites ready to dominate the cameras. Manu didn't have those things. He didn't have the body of an American super athlete, didn't speak fluent English, didn't walk into the locker room like someone who was expected. He entered the NBA like someone arriving late to the party, where all the good seats were taken and no one was obligated to make room for him. Right from the early days, Manu felt the difference clearly. He wasn't prioritized, wasn't protected by reputation, wasn't given minutes as a long-term investment. Every time he stepped on the court felt like a test, where one small mistake could lead to far greater doubt than for other players. In the NBA, where everything moved at a brutal pace, Manu had to learn to survive in a state of constant observation, but rarely being waited on. No one said he would be the future of the team. No one built a narrative around him. He was seen as an add-on option, a tactical choice, not the center of any plan. That didn't surprise Manu, because he'd been used to proving himself since leaving Argentina. But in the NBA, that feeling was amplified many times over. Language became an invisible but heavy barrier. Manu understood the game faster than many, but communicating his thoughts was never complete. He had to learn to let actions speak for him, to make every pass, every cut, every daring moment an answer that needed no translation. But even when he played well, recognition came slowly. The NBA wasn't quick to believe in unusual stories, especially when they didn't fit the familiar mold. Manu wasn't the promoted star prototype, had no image to sell, no glamorous origin story to make people patiently wait. He always had to step onto the court, feeling that today he needed to do more than yesterday just to hold his spot. The central feeling of this period wasn't fear. It was the quiet exhaustion of never being waited on. Manu played with the awareness that if he didn't create immediate value, no one would say, "Give him more time." Every minute on the floor was a brief chance to prove necessity, not greatness. He learned to accept that as a reality without complaint. In the NBA, some players were allowed to play poorly to learn, but Manu wasn't. He didn't have that privilege. He had to be right from the start, effective the moment his name was called, ready to fill any gap the team needed, no matter how small the role. That lack of being waited on gradually shaped how Manu existed in the league. He didn't demand, didn't fight for, didn't speak up about what he deserved. Instead, he observed, adapted, and found the cracks where he could become irreplaceable. He accepted not being seen as the face of the team, accepted that his contributions were only mentioned when necessary. That made Manu safer in the system, but it also forced him to keep living with the feeling that he was only kept because of utility, not intrinsic value. The NBA became a world where Manu always stood on the line between being needed and being forgotten. and that very line forced him to maintain an almost ruthless level of focus. In every city, every road trip, Manu carried the same unspoken question: am I necessary enough today? No one asked it for him, but he asked it of himself before every game. And when the game ended, win or lose, he folded that question away, ready to unfold it the next day. That wasn't the life of a pampered star. It was the life of someone always defending his right to exist. The NBA wasn't made for Manu, but Manu chose not to leave it. He understood that if he wanted to stay, he had to accept these rules, had to keep proving without expecting patience from anyone. It was in that environment, with no waiting, that Manu began perfecting a version of himself suited to the harshest demands. He learned to do more with less, learned to turn scattered minutes into clear impact, learned to exist without needing his name called. But every lesson came with a cost, because when you live too long in a state of constant proof, you gradually forget what unconditional trust feels like. The NBA taught Manu how to win, but it also taught him to accept that winning didn't mean being understood. And from there, a new, even more dangerous habit formed: the belief that not being waited on was normal, and that to survive, sometimes you had to turn yourself into a perfect tool, even if it wore down part of your real self. The San Antonio Spurs didn't come to Manu Ginóbili like a promised land. They came as an already existing structure, cold, disciplined, and so perfect, there was no room for superfluous personalities. There, no one asked Manu who he wanted to be. They only looked at what he could do to make the system run smoother. The Spurs needed Manu, that was true, but they didn't need him to shine in his own way, didn't need a star demanding space, didn't need an ego that had to be protected. They needed someone willing to go into the dark corners of the game, do the things no one else wanted, and disappear the moment the spotlight threatened to hit him directly. Manu understood that very quickly, not because anyone said it, but because everything at the Spurs operated on unspoken signals. Here, you were respected if you didn't disrupt order. You were trusted if you didn't demand attention. You were kept if you knew when to step up and when to step back. The Spurs were a machine, and Manu was a perfect gear, flexible, intelligent, ready to reshape to fit any empty spot. He played with instinctive creativity, but was required to frame that instinct within collective discipline. He could explode, but only if it didn't shake the system. He could become the center, but only in the moments he was allowed. Manu accepted that not because he was weak, but because he understood it was the only way to survive long-term in an organization unforgiving of misalignment. Gradually, an unsigned agreement formed between Manu and the Spurs. The team would give him trust, important minutes, collective titles. In return, he would sacrifice his right to live fully as his true self. Manu stayed silent about reduced roles, silent about moments that could have been his own story, silent when his name wasn't mentioned first. That silence wasn't blind resignation. It was a conscious choice, repeated until it became part of who he was. The Spurs ran best when Manu accepted not disrupting the common rhythm, when he was ready to come off the bench with the same focus as a starter, when he was ready to take on tough tasks without needing praise. The system rewarded stability and punished deviation, and Manu, with his sharp basketball mind, understood that the only way to survive was to dissolve into it. But in that very process of dissolving, another life began forming in parallel, quiet and heavy. A life where Manu constantly weighed doing right by the team against doing right by himself, winning with the group against asking what he was losing. Every time he held back an instinctive move to choose the safer option, every time he accepted a less noticed role to maintain balance, a piece of him was put away. The Spurs didn't force Manu to sacrifice, but they created an environment where sacrifice became the most logical choice. And Manu, with the foundation from childhood that value lay in endurance, didn't resist that logic. He turned sacrifice into habit, silence into language, acceptance into identity. On the outside, it was the image of an ideal player, always putting the team first, always ready to do whatever it took to win. On the inside, it was an increasingly clear split between the person Manu could have become and the person he had to become to fit the system. That unsigned agreement had no expiration date, no protective clauses, no moment to renegotiate. It stretched through every season, every playoff, every championship, and each time the Spurs raised a trophy, Manu felt more clearly the invisible cost of victory. The double life didn't start with one big decision. It started with hundreds of small, reasonable, correct decisions. So much so that no one saw the tragedy forming. The Spurs needed Manu, but they needed a Manu who had learned to disappear at the right moment. And Manu, in his effort to be needed, accepted that as an inevitable part of his fate. Manu Ginobili's decision to come off the bench didn't arrive like a dramatic moment with tense meetings or heated arguments. It came quietly, almost naturally, the way the most important things in his life always happened. There was no press release, no long explanation, no public resistance from Manu. He listened, he understood, and he nodded. In the world of American basketball, where starting wasn't just a position but an identity, that decision carried the weight of an event. Even though on the surface it looked like a reasonable tactical adjustment, Manu knew very well that he was good enough to start, capable enough to be the centerpiece of another team, energetic enough to carry more than what the Spurs were giving him. But he also knew the system worked best when he stepped back. And so he stepped back. Not because of a lack of confidence, but because he understood the game too well. From that moment, another life of Manu Ginóbili began to close without any farewell ceremony. That was the life where he could have become a star in the traditional NBA sense, where his name was called first, where the stats fully reflected his impact, where his career story was told in a simpler, easier-to-understand way. But that life was never allowed to step into the light. It ended the moment Manu accepted the bench, because the bench wasn't just a spot on the sideline, it was an unspoken declaration that he was willing to sacrifice an entire version of himself for the perfection of the collective. Manu never said it out loud, but he lived with it every day. Becoming the sixth man didn't make Manu play worse. In fact, it made him more dangerous, more unpredictable, and more effective in decisive moments. But that very effectiveness hid a bitter paradox. Manu entered the game when others were tired, when the game needed a fresh spark, when the flow needed to be broken. He did it so excellently that people began to see it as his natural role, forgetting that it was a choice, not a limitation of his ability. Every time he exploded off the bench, every time he turned the game around, the system got reinforced a little more, and the chance for Manu to be seen as a starting star slipped a little further away. He became the problem solver, not the one built around. The most painful thing wasn't that Manu was underrated. It was that he never spoke up to demand anything different. Not once did he publicly say he deserved more. Not once did he explain to the media what that decision had cut away from him. That silence wasn't because he didn't feel the loss. It was because he'd been taught from very early on that his value didn't lie in being prioritized. Manu stepped into every game with the same spirit, whether he started or came off the bench. But inside, he understood that another path had been permanently closed. The path where he could be waited on, built around, protected like other stars. That path was never tested, because Manu himself crossed it out to keep the system from collapsing. In the locker room, Manu didn't complain. On the practice court, he didn't change his attitude. He was still the hard worker, the one willing to sacrifice his body, the one diving into the most dangerous plays. But that acceptance came with a quiet psychological cost. Every time he heard someone else's name called in the starting lineup, Manu had to remind himself that it didn't diminish the value of what he contributed. Every time he looked at the final stat sheet, he had to learn not to measure himself by numbers that didn't fully reflect his impact. It was a long process of self-adjustment, where Manu constantly had to convince himself that this sacrifice was right, that collective victory was enough to make up for what the individual had lost. But that self-persuasion wasn't always easy. There were nights, when the game was over and the noise had died down, when Manu faced a question with no answer. Was he betraying himself? No one forced him onto the bench. No one stripped his starting spot by power. Manu himself had chosen it, and so he also had to carry the unshareable regret alone. That was the kind of pain that wasn't allowed to be expressed, because expressing it would mean shaking the choice that had been seen as noble. Manu understood that if he spoke up, if he showed dissatisfaction, the entire image of a selfless player who put the team above all would collapse. And so, he kept silent. The biggest event in Manu Ginóbili's life wasn't tied to an injury or a defeat. It was tied to the moment he himself closed off another future. From then on, every Spurs success carried a complex aftertaste. Victories came, titles came, but with them came the feeling that a part of him hadn't been allowed to live fully. He became the ideal model of sacrifice, but the price of that model was the disappearance of another version, a version that could have burned brighter, been recognized more clearly. That version didn't die from failure. It died because it was never allowed to exist. When people talk about Manu Ginóbili as the greatest sixth man, very few stop to think that that title is also a quiet tombstone for another life, a life that Manu himself buried with his calm and discipline. He didn't cry, didn't blame, didn't resent the system that benefited from that sacrifice. He kept playing, kept contributing, kept fulfilling his role with astonishing precision. But from the moment he accepted the bench, Manu Ginóbili's double life entered an irreversible phase. One half of him was celebrated, loved, remembered, the other half where untapped potential, unprioritized dreams quietly ended, without anyone knowing. And Manu, as always, carried that ending in silence, treating it as a necessary part of victory, even though deep down he understood that not every victory comes without loss. The Athens 2004 Olympics didn't come to Manu Ginóbili as just a tournament. It came as a rare moment when the world paused, so he could breathe at his own rhythm. When he put on Argentina's jersey, all the layers of suppression he'd carried through his NBA years suddenly melted away, not because he tried to escape them, but because here, for the first time, no one demanded that he shrink himself. In front of him was Team USA, the ultimate symbol of world basketball, a collection of names accustomed to privilege, to standing in the center of the light. But in that moment, Manu didn't look at them with the deference of a supporting role. He stepped onto the court like someone who'd never learned to step back, as if his entire previous life had just been a long wait to reach this second. No system demanded he disappear. No role forced him to wait for someone else's turn. Here, Manu was allowed to be fully himself, unconditionally. The game against Team USA didn't unfold the way history usually tells it, not just as a collective win or a global shock, but as a quiet personal declaration. Manu played with a freedom the NBA rarely let him touch. The bold drives, the decisive choices, the daring moments he usually had to weigh carefully in Spurs colors now flowed naturally, as if he were giving back to himself the years that had been suppressed. He didn't need to glance at the bench to check if he was allowed to do it. He didn't need to yield the rhythm to anyone else. Every time the ball left his hands, it was a choice born from instinct, not from agreement. And in that freedom, Manu didn't just play well, he played true to the person he'd been before he learned to disappear. When Argentina beat Team USA, the whole world called it an upset. But for Manu, it was a painful confirmation. He saw very clearly who he could be when not forced into the framework of mandatory sacrifice. He didn't need the bench to make an impact, didn't need to enter late to change the game. He was the center, the heartbeat, the one every decision revolved around. And that came to him so naturally, it was frightening. As if this version of Manu had never disappeared, it had just been stored away. The points, the assists, the leadership moments on the court weren't new, they'd been delayed. The 2004 Olympics didn't create a different Manu, it just let the world see the Manu he'd learned to hide. But in that brilliance, another pain emerged more clearly than ever, because Manu understood that this moment was the exception, not the rule. He knew he would return to the NBA, to the Spurs, to the system where this freedom didn't exist. Every play in Athens, therefore, carried a bitter aftertaste, because it showed him the price of the choices he'd made and would continue to make. He didn't celebrate the victory with the innocence of someone who'd just found a new path. He celebrated like someone who'd glimpsed another future, but knew for sure he wouldn't follow it. That peak didn't open a door. It closed a question. When the tournament ended, Manu brought the gold medal back to Argentina as national pride. But in his invisible baggage, there was something much heavier, the clear awareness of what he'd sacrificed. He'd seen himself at the top when he didn't have to yield to anyone, when he didn't have to suppress, when he didn't have to disappear. And precisely because he'd seen it so clearly, he understood even more deeply the cost of returning to the familiar life. The Olympics didn't change Manu's choices. Those choices had been anchored long ago, but they made the sacrifice concrete, tangible, with memories. From then on, every time he stepped back with the Spurs, every time he came off the bench, every time he stayed silent amid praise for others, the image of Athens, of an untrimmed, unlimited Manu would always exist in his mind. The irony is that the greatest victory of Manu's life didn't set him free. It bound him even tighter to his double life. Because after tasting what it felt like to be fully himself, continuing to live as a diminished version became harder, even though he never admitted it. The 2004 Olympics became an indelible milestone, a quiet reminder that his sacrifice didn't stem from a lack of ability, but from choice. And precisely because it was a choice, the pain that came with it couldn't be blamed on anyone else. When people look back at Athens and call it the greatest moment in Argentine basketball, few think about the other side of that glory. Few realize that for Manu Ginóbili, it was also the moment he most clearly saw another life that had been set aside. A life where he could play without needing permission, lead without stepping back, exist without proving his necessity every single day. That life didn't vanish in defeat, it vanished in victory. And when he left Athens, Manu carried the gold medal around his neck, but he also carried a subtler pain. The pain of someone who had touched complete freedom only to know for certain he wouldn't live with it long term. After Athens, Manu Ginóbili returned to the NBA, not as someone newly liberated, but as someone carrying a heavier secret than before. That secret wasn't in the playbook, wasn't in the locker room, it was inside his own body, because from that point onward, Manu's body began speaking for the things he never allowed himself to say out loud. The injuries appeared without fanfare, not tied to one specific breaking moment, but accumulating gradually over the years, like the inevitable consequence of constantly pushing himself past limits without ever being allowed true rest. Hamstrings, ankles, hands, knees, lower back, one by one they started speaking up, not with violent protest, but with lingering, persistent pain, enough to remind him that every sacrifice leaves a mark. Manu wasn't the kind of player who could rely on superior physique to absorb contact. His game was built on daring, on unexpected cuts, on throwing himself into spaces others avoided, and every time he did, his body paid the price. But Manu didn't see that as unusual. He saw pain as part of the job, a reasonable cost for continuing to exist in the system he'd chosen. As seasons passed, Manu stepped into every game with pains whose true severity only he understood. Painkillers became a familiar part of the routine, not to gain an edge, but to maintain the ability to play. There were evenings when he played in a state where, if he stopped to fully feel it, he probably couldn't have kept going. But Manu didn't stop. He taped up. He injected. He suppressed the sensation. Because what mattered wasn't the state of his body. It was what the team needed at that moment. Playing while not fully healed became normal, just like he'd grown accustomed to sacrificing his role, sacrificing priority. No one forced him to do it. There was no official order demanding Manu play in less than perfect condition. But the unspoken agreement between him and the system made him understand that if he could play, then he should play. Rest was a luxury for those who were waited on, and Manu wasn't. The physical tragedy of Manu wasn't that he suffered career-ending injuries, it was that he always played in a state that was never truly whole. His body didn't collapse in one moment. It wore down, little by little, just like his spirit had worn down from living two parallel lives. Every physical pain was a reminder that he was carrying more than what was visible. But Manu never turned those pains into a story. He didn't use them to explain slumps, didn't use them to ask for sympathy. Pain, for him, was something to be handled in silence, like every other inner conflict. And that very silence made the tragedy deeper. There were periods when Manu's body reacted so fiercely that it forced him to face the truth that he was no longer young, that the years of sacrifice couldn't be undone. But each time, he found a way to return faster than expected. Not because he wasn't afraid of losing his career, but because he was afraid of losing his role, afraid of the feeling that he was no longer needed, afraid of sitting out and watching others do the job he still believed he could do well. That fear was never spoken, but it drove many decisions. Manu returned to the court, not in perfect condition, but in usable condition. And for him, usable was enough. The mental tragedy ran parallel to the physical one. Every pain wasn't just a biological signal, it was also an unanswered question. Was this sacrifice truly necessary? Manu didn't allow himself to dig into that question, because digging would mean doubting the entire path he'd chosen. Instead, he kept moving forward, carrying the pains as part of his identity. His body became the most loyal witness to the double life he was living. A public life, where he was the symbol of intelligence and victory, and a private life where every sprint came at the cost of pain. Those two tragedies intertwined, inseparable, because without the mental suppression, perhaps his body would have been treated more kindly, and without the physical wear, perhaps the inner questions wouldn't have been so repressed. But Manu didn't choose to analyze or change. He chose to continue. When looking back on those years, people might call it resilience, warrior spirit, a model of sacrifice. But for Manu Ginóbili, it was also a long stretch of days where his body paid the price for things he never allowed himself to voice. The pains weren't just consequences of contact. They were the physical expression of a life that always put others' needs before his own. And it was in that quiet paying of the price that Manu's tragedy stood out more clearly than ever. A man so accustomed to enduring that he could no longer distinguish where the boundary that needed protection lay, and what could still be sacrificed. Among all the spaces where Manu Ginóbili learned to disappear at the right moment, family was the only place he didn't have to do that. When he took off his jersey and left the cold hallways of the arena, Manu returned to a world that didn't measure value by minutes played, didn't ask if he'd sacrificed enough, didn't demand he prove his necessity. To his wife and children, Manu wasn't the sixth man, wasn't the problem solver, wasn't the perfect gear in a giant machine. He was just a husband, a father, a person allowed to be tired without hiding it. There, no one expected him to step back so others could shine. No one needed him to stay silent to maintain order. Family gave Manu a role that didn't demand the sacrifice of his ego, and because of that, it became the most precious refuge in a life accustomed to shrinking himself. But even in that safe space, the accumulated fatigue followed him home. Manu didn't step into family life like a blank slate. He carried the years of tension, the long nights of aching, the unanswered questions. There were times when the silence had become too deeply ingrained to fully remove. He loved his family, but he also had to relearn how to be fully present, because for so many years, his presence on the court had always come with preparing for the next disappearance. At home, Manu didn't have to sacrifice his role, but he still had to face a tired body and a mind accustomed to suppressing emotion. The quiet evenings with family didn't instantly erase the built-up pressure, but they gave him rare moments to breathe, where no one judged him by performance. With his children, Manu wasn't an icon, he was a father who was there. He didn't need to teach them how to become special, because he'd spent his whole life learning the opposite lesson. He taught them patience, respect, and the value of being together without needing to stand out. Those moments were small, simple, but for Manu, they carried deeper meaning than any title. With family, he didn't need to brace himself for being subbed out, didn't need to wonder if he was still needed. But that didn't mean every wound was healed. Family wasn't a miracle that could erase the years of sacrifice, couldn't make the physical pains or inner questions disappear. It was only a place that allowed Manu to set the burden down for a moment before having to pick it up again the next day. The biggest difference between the court and family was that here, Manu didn't have to disappear so others could live fully. But that very difference sometimes also revealed the depth of exhaustion he'd grown used to hiding. There were moments, sitting quietly with family, when Manu felt the gap between the man he was at home and the man he was on the court. That gap wasn't conflict, it was the result of a divided life. He didn't complain about it, but he was very aware that family could only be a refuge, not a place of complete restoration. The years that had passed couldn't be undone by love alone, even though that love was real and deep. Family helped Manu remember that he didn't exist only to fulfill a role, but it also reminded him that past choices left long-lasting marks. When he was with his loved ones, Manu didn't need to be the best, didn't need to be the most effective, but he still carried the habit of putting himself last. That wasn't easy to change, because it had been forged over decades. Family didn't demand more sacrifice from him, but it also couldn't erase the deeply ingrained instinct to sacrifice that had become part of who he was. In the relative peace of family life, Manu began to realize a complex truth. He had spent his entire life becoming necessary to others, to the point where simply being loved unconditionally became an experience he had to relearn. Family didn't require him to disappear, but to truly be present, he had to confront the fatigue he'd carried for too long. That didn't happen in one moment. There was no clear turning point. It unfolded slowly, through quiet evenings, simple meals, very ordinary moments. Manu Ginóbili's family wasn't a fairy tale that ended all tragedies. It didn't fully heal the wounds, didn't erase what had been lost, but it gave him a place to exist without having to shrink himself, a place where he could be tired without being judged, could be silent without being misunderstood, could stay without proving anything. And in a life where sacrifice had become instinct, that alone was enough to become a rare form of peace, fragile though it was, incomplete though it was. As Manu Ginóbili's career gradually drew toward its end, a strange phenomenon began to form around him, not loud, not malicious, but persistent and cold, silent, forgetting. Manu was never the face of the league, never appeared on posters representing an era, never built up as an icon, for people to easily retell history with a few familiar names. He didn't enter GOAT debates, had no media campaigns backing him, had no stories retold over and over to etch his image into collective memory. And the irony was that precisely because he performed his role of sacrifice so well, the role that made the team win his story became hard to tell in a simple way. Manu wasn't hated, wasn't denied, wasn't looked down on. He was just gradually set aside in the way people remembered the NBA, like a complicated detail that didn't fit neat, quick summaries. That forgetting didn't come from failure or scandal, it came from Manu, never demanding the center spot in collective memory. In a sports culture where people remember dominant individuals, big egos, and easily comparable numbers, Manu was an inconvenient story. He didn't have one explosive single season to hang as a benchmark, no fixed role to label, no repeated image that became iconic. He existed in gray areas, where value lay in impact rather than attention. And those gray areas are very easy to overlook when history is told in broad strokes. Manu also didn't help himself escape that forgetting. He didn't self-promote, didn't push back when underrated, didn't join comparisons to assert his place. The silence he chose throughout his career continued even after he stopped playing. Manu didn't appear constantly on TV, didn't keep retelling his story, didn't try to correct how others remembered him. For him, not being mentioned enough seemed like an acceptable consequence of the path he'd chosen. But that very acceptance made the tragedy subtler, because people don't need to be celebrated to exist, but they do need to be remembered accurately to not be misunderstood. Manu's tragedy wasn't being ranked below his contemporaries' stars, it was being mentioned in a simplified way. People called him the greatest sixth man, as if that was his entire being. They mentioned his intelligence, his daring, his explosive moments, but rarely stopped long enough to understand the cost of those things. Manu was remembered as the perfect supplement to the system, not as a person who had to trim himself down for that system to exist. And when the story is simplified, the sacrifice is also made lighter, as if it were an easy choice that left no damage. No one hated Manu, and precisely because of that, no one stood up to defend his story against the forgetting. He was loved, but safely, respected, but from afar, acknowledged, but not deeply explored. This silent forgetting was different from criticism or controversy because it didn't provoke reaction. It quietly shaped how a generation of fans misunderstood the depth of sacrifice Manu went through. When there was no debate, no confrontation, no taking sides, the story gradually drifted out of the center of memory. Manu understood that better than anyone. He knew that choosing to live within the system, choosing to put the collective above himself, meant accepting that his name wouldn't be mentioned in the loudest ways. But understanding didn't mean not feeling it. There were moments, looking back on past seasons, when Manu realized what he'd done would be hard to measure by familiar standards. And when something is hard to measure, it's very easy to overlook. He didn't resent it, but he carried a quiet sadness of someone who knew his story would often be told missing important chapters. The tragedy wasn't that Manu wasn't included in big debates. It was that those debates were rarely subtle enough to contain his story. Manu didn't fit simple comparison frames because his career wasn't built to win individual races. It was built to optimize the collective, to fill gaps, to solve problems others didn't want to face. And those things, no matter how important, were very hard to become the center of public memory. That silent forgetting was the final price of the double life. A public life full of victories but not told correctly, and a private life full of sacrifice but unseen. Manu wasn't hated, wasn't denied, but he also wasn't remembered deeply enough for people to understand what he had to trade away. And perhaps the most painful thing wasn't history forgetting his name, it was history remembering him too lightly, too neatly, too safely, to fully reflect a man who spent his whole life in silence so others could shine. Retirement came to Manu Ginóbili not like a carefully prepared milestone, but like a door closing behind him when he'd grown used to not making noise. No farewell tour, no extended goodbye games for fans to stand and honor him, no grand ceremonies staged for history to capture on film. Manu left the NBA the way he'd lived in it, quietly, at the right time, and without demanding anyone keep him. When the retirement announcement came, it didn't cause a shock, didn't interrupt the news flow, because Manu had never been the center of the noise. But that very quietness reflected him more fully than any ceremony could. No one held Manu back, and he didn't wait for anyone to do it. After those final seasons, his body had said enough, even though he rarely listened to it fully. The pains could no longer be easily hidden, recoveries took longer, and moments on the court no longer carried the familiar daring. Manu didn't need a goodbye ceremony to understand he'd reached his limit. He understood it in the practical, cold way. He understood everything in his career. When the role could no longer be performed as fully as before, it was time to step away. No public regret. No complaints about not being recognized enough. Manu closed the NBA chapter like a task completed. Nothing more. In a culture where retirement is often turned into an event, Manu's exit left many people only realizing he'd vanished after everything was already done. No final stretch of games for fans to prepare emotionally, no collective moment to pause and look back at the path he'd walked. Manu didn't ask for that, because asking would contradict everything he'd chosen for 30 years. He wasn't used to being prioritized, and he didn't want to create an exception at the very end. Leaving without anyone holding him back wasn't a sign of lack of appreciation. It was the natural consequence of a life accustomed to making himself smaller. Retirement, for Manu, didn't bring instant liberation. It didn't erase the accumulated questions, didn't immediately dissolve the fatigue embedded in his body and mind. When there was no more schedule to hold on to, no more role to fulfill, Manu faced an unfamiliar emptiness. For so many years, his existence had been defined by what the team needed, how the system ran, and what gap he could fill. Now, with no one needing him that way, Manu had to learn to exist without a clear task. That wasn't sweet freedom, it was a slow adjustment process, where he had to relearn how to be present without disappearing right after finishing the job. No farewell tour also meant no collective moment to close out the emotions. Manu didn't get to see thousands stand for him one last time, didn't hear extended tributes, but perhaps that fit him better than any other script. A big ceremony would have put him at the center, forcing him to accept attention he'd spent his life avoiding. Manu didn't need a scripted ending, because his life had never followed easy-to-tell templates. When he left the NBA, Manu didn't carry bitterness, but he also didn't carry a sense of completeness. He understood that he had done everything he could within the framework he had chosen, but he also understood that there were things that had never been allowed to live. That quiet withdrawal, therefore, had two sides, both the logical end of a career built on sacrifice and the final confirmation that his double life didn't need a grand curtain call. It ended the way it had operated. No one held him back. No one objected. No one made noise. Manu Ginóbili left the NBA the way someone accustomed to not standing at the center does. An ending not staged, not decorated, not extended to create emotion. But it was precisely in that simplicity that people saw most clearly the essence of who he was. Retirement wasn't the moment Manu disappeared, because he had learned to do that long ago. It was only the last time he did what his entire career had taught him. Step away at the right moment, leave victory behind, and carry the questions without needing anyone to answer them for him. After retirement, Manu Ginóbili didn't step into a brighter new life, nor did he fall into loud tragedy. He stepped into an emptiness without practice schedules, without connecting flights, without locker rooms where everything was prearranged. Time, which had been sliced so ruthlessly throughout his career, suddenly stretched out in front of him in a way that was both freeing and frightening. Manu no longer had to disappear at the right moment, but he also no longer had a reason to appear. And it was in that excess of time that the part of himself left behind for so many years began to quietly rise, not demanding, not blaming, just existing like a question that had never been placed in the right spot. The early days after retirement didn't feel like victory or relief. Manu woke up without knowing what role he needed to fulfill today. No more games to prepare for, no more system to serve, no more need to sacrifice anything further. That, instead of liberating him, made him face a deeper emptiness. For 30 years, his value had been defined by how necessary he was. Now, with no one needing him in the old way, Manu had to learn to exist without relying on utility. That was a harder lesson than any tactic he had ever learned on the court. Time began doing the work it had never been allowed to do before, opening up the postponed questions. Manu no longer had to answer them to keep playing, no longer had to push them aside to protect his focus. Those questions weren't accusatory, they didn't ask why he had sacrificed, but what he had lost in the process. There were quiet afternoons, when the noise of the arena was gone, when Manu felt more clearly than ever the existence of another version of himself, the version that hadn't been allowed to live fully. That version wasn't angry, didn't demand compensation, but it also didn't disappear. It was there, like an old acquaintance he had never had time to talk to. Living after retirement, Manu didn't try to recreate the spotlight. He didn't rush to fill the emptiness with new roles, didn't dive into projects to keep feeling needed. He allowed himself to slow down, even though that slowing sometimes brought discomfort. With no more packed schedule, his body began to feel more clearly the consequences of years of endurance. But at the same time, his mind also got a chance to rest in a way that painkillers or short breaks had never provided. Manu didn't call it healing, because healing implied an ending. He understood that some parts of himself would always carry the marks of the past, and continuing to live didn't mean erasing them. The questions that no longer needed answers became part of everyday life. Manu didn't need to explain to anyone why he had chosen that path, didn't need to prove the sacrifice was worth it. With no more audience, no more scoreboards, those questions lost their urgency. They didn't need clear answers, because they no longer decided his future. Manu learned to let them exist alongside his present life, like memories that no longer stabbed, but also didn't fully fade. After retirement, Manu Ginóbili lived with the part that had been left behind, not through dramatic regret, but through quiet acceptance. He didn't try to revive what had passed, nor did he deny the value of what had been lost. He let time do its work, not to repair, but to put everything in its proper place. Manu's life after basketball had no climax, no spectacular rebirth. But in that silence, for the first time, he didn't have to disappear so others could shine. And perhaps that was the biggest shift for a man who had spent his whole life stepping back. When no system needed him anymore, Manu Ginóbili faced a truth he had postponed for 30 years, that parallel life had ended. No more team to serve, no more structure to dissolve into, no more justifiable reason to keep sacrificing. The double life, which had once helped him survive, once given him meaning, officially closed. But that closing didn't bring relief. It was like the moment of removing armor worn too long, exposing scars that had never gone away. Manu no longer had to divide himself to fit the system, but he also couldn't go back to the person he was before learning to do that. When there was no longer a reason to sacrifice, Manu realized that sacrifice had become a reflex. He no longer had to step back for anyone, but the habit of putting himself last was still there. He no longer had to disappear at the right time, but silence still came more naturally than speaking up. The double life had closed on paper, but it left a deep imprint in how he saw the world and saw himself. The years lived in a state of separation had shaped him in ways not easily reversed. There was no specific day marking the complete end, because things that had sunk in so deeply didn't vanish just because circumstances changed. Manu didn't seek complete healing, perhaps because he understood that concept didn't exist for lives like his. There was no single awakening moment to wipe away the years gone by, no perfect answer for questions once left hanging. He didn't need to explain why he had chosen to sacrifice, nor did he need to prove whether that choice was right or wrong. When there was no system left to protect, those choices stood alone, like uneditable truths. Manu learned to live with them, not by forgetting, but by acknowledging that every victory left a price. The scars of the double life didn't always hurt, but they were always present. They showed up in how he reacted to attention, in how he avoided being placed at the center, in the restraint when others tried to retell his story in a simple way. Manu knew that story couldn't be neatly packaged in a few titles or a few highlight moments, and he also knew he had no obligation to make it easier to understand. The silence now was no longer sacrifice for the system, it was a personal choice. When the double life closed, Manu didn't step into a brilliant new chapter. He stepped into a fragile balance, where he allowed himself to exist without needing to become necessary. That didn't bring complete happiness, but it brought honesty. He no longer ran from the scars, nor did he try to turn them into badges of honor. He left them there, as part of who he was, neither hiding nor displaying them. There was no complete healing, because what was lost couldn't be returned. But there was also no unfinished tragedy, because Manu had lived true to his choices, even though their price was only fully understood when everything ended. The double life closed not with a big noise, but with the familiar silence. And in that silence, Manu Ginóbili no longer had to sacrifice anything more. But he also couldn't deny that those very sacrifices had left scars that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Manu Ginóbili didn't end his story as a mythologized legend. He didn't step out of history with the GOAT title, wasn't placed on endless debate scales, didn't become the perfect icon for people to admire from afar. And perhaps that was what made his story heavier than all others. Because Manu didn't live to become great in an easy-to-tell way. He lived to make others win. And in the process, he paid a price very few saw deeply enough. Manu sacrificed not one game, not one role, but an entire other version of himself. A version that could have shone brighter, been waited on more, been built around more. That version didn't die from lack of talent, nor from failure. It died because it was never prioritized. Manu buried that version with reasonable, correct, noble decisions, so noble that no one had reason to object. And precisely because no one objected, that loss became even more silent and profound. Not mythologizing Manu is the only way to honor him honestly, because if we turn him into the perfect icon of sacrifice, we unintentionally lighten the price he paid. Manu wasn't someone unaware of what he could have been. The 2004 Olympics showed him very clearly. The rare moments of being himself gave him an unforgettable glimpse of another path. But instead of chasing that path, he turned back, kept disappearing, kept stepping back, kept putting the collective above himself. Not because he lacked the courage to choose himself, but because he had enough courage to let it go. That price wasn't paid once it was paid every day. In a body worn down by injuries, in a mind accustomed to suppressing questions. In the silence, when his name wasn't mentioned deeply enough, in a career that ended without anyone holding him back. Manu paid by accepting that he wouldn't be remembered in the loudest way, even though his influence seeped into every victory. He paid by living with scars that didn't need complete healing, because they were proof of choices made. And then, when it was all over, Manu didn't demand that history correct how it remembered him. He didn't seek belated recognition, didn't need a collective apology. He simply existed, quietly, with the understanding that he had lived true to what he chose, even though what he chose didn't bring completeness. That wasn't grand tragedy. It was very human tragedy, understanding clearly the price of the path taken, but still walking it to the end. Manu Ginóbili's story, therefore, doesn't close with a declaration, but with an aftertaste. The aftertaste of a man who paid enough for others' victories. Not needing to be placed on a pedestal, not needing to be called the greatest, just needing to be remembered accurately, as a man who sacrificed an entire version of himself so the collective could exist. And perhaps, in a world that always honors those at the center, remembering accurately someone who chose to stand aside like Manu is the hardest and most necessary form of honor. Manu Ginobili's story leaves a very different kind of sadness. Not the sadness of failure, but the sadness of sacrifice taken for granted. The most heartbreaking thing isn't the injuries, the years playing with painkillers, or the quiet retirement without a farewell tour. It's Manu's lifelong decision, voluntarily setting aside another version of himself. In the story, the 2004 Olympics moment stands out as the deepest cut. It was the only time Manu played without suppression, not as a supporting role, not as sixth man, not as a gear in the system, precisely because he saw so clearly who he could be in Argentina's jersey. Returning to the NBA to continue the silence, continue the sacrifice, became a mental tragedy that stretched over many years. In San Antonio Spurs, Manu accepted the unsigned agreement. The team wins, and he disappears at the right time. The decision to go to the bench, without protest, without explanation, was a bigger event than any injury, because it marked the quiet end of another life that was never lived. After that, his body began paying the price, playing while not healed, accumulating pain, just as his spirit had grown accustomed to accumulating unspoken questions. When he retired, no one held him back. Manu left exactly as he had lived, without noise, without demanding to be remembered. The lesson for American life today lies in that very paradox. A society that always encourages, be the star, be the best, very easily forgets the people who make the system run but don't stand at the center. Manu's story reminds us that collective success always has a personal price, and not every sacrifice should be romanticized. In real life, sometimes we also disappear, so family, company, or organization can win. What's important isn't just the sacrifice, it's being aware of what we're trading away, so we don't reach the end of life, only to realize a part of ourselves was left behind too long in silence. If the story of Manu Ginobili's quiet sacrifice and very human price has touched you, please hit subscribe to keep following stories behind the spotlight that few tell. Thank you for listening all the way to the end, and see you in the next video, where we'll step together into another great but never easy life.